Hey everybody, it's Charlie at Charlie Slybox, and we've had this Ask Charlie thing going on, and I have gotten the same question several times, and I'm going to give extra kudos to everybody that asked it because it's a darn fine question. And that question is, can I explain the differences between deer and elk and yearling elk and cow elk and bull elk and all the different kinds of hair and what you might look for? And that it really is a good question. I'll start off by saying there is a great chapter in a really good book called Charlie Craven's Basic Fly Tying on hair. And the reason I'm so good at explaining this is because when I wrote that book, I wrote a couple paragraphs about hair, and my editor, Jay Nichols, said, hey, you need to sit down and really explain this better. So I really had to dig into it, and it was like doing homework and was not fun anymore, but I did it. So now I've got a pretty good spiel to explain the differences between hair. And really, this is what I do in all my classes. Really, the differences in hair, what you need to kind of be aware of is if you think of a strand of deer or elk or moose or any kind of hair like that, like a straw, like a drinking straw. It is not truly hollow like a drinking straw. It is more cellular in nature. But if you think of it like a drinking straw, what you want to think about is the outside diameter of the hair, the inside diameter of the hair, and the wall thickness. The wall thickness being the big part. The wall thickness is what determines how hard or soft the hair might be. If the wall thickness is thick, that hair is not going to compress as well. It's not going to flare as well or as much as a hair that has a thinner wall with a larger inside diameter. So with that being said, I will say that generally speaking, because there's always variations, it depends on where it comes from on the critter. Generally speaking, deer hair is going to have a thinner wall than elk hair. That's the big difference. Deer hair tends to float better than elk hair because it's lighter and has got more inside diameter. It tends to not be as durable as elk hair because it's got a thinner wall, so it can break off a little bit more easily. But that's sort of the gist of it. That's the difference between the hairs. So when you start with something like right here in front of me, I've got a piece of yearling elk. And I know it's confusing. We've got a rack with I don't know, 500 different kinds of hair on it. And I know it's confusing. So this is a piece of yearling elk, and this is one of my favorite hairs to work with. Yearling elk is a fairly long hair, 1.5 to 2 inches long. Lends itself really well to flies like humpies and stimulators and wings on stonefly patterns. This is an elk hair from a yearling elk, and it could be a bull or a cow. It could be either. The fact that it's a yearling is what's important. And what that is hair that's a little bit finer than the adult version of those hairs. So a little bit finer, tends to have really nice crisp tips. And we'll get a nice close-up picture of this. But what I mean by crisp tips is you want to look for hair where you're going to use the tips for a wing. You want to look for hair that has a short, abrupt tip, not a long, wispy black tip. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that as well. A short, abrupt tip is going to mean the hair is hollow right up to the tip. So when you're only using the last 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch of the hair, if that is all black tip, there's no hollowness left to it, so you won't have the buoyancy out of it like you would with a hair with a more abrupt tip. Yearling elk has got really nice, short, abrupt tips, typically. And again, there's always variation to it. But nice, short, abrupt tips, good band of color, kind of fades from a gray into a tan cream color with that short black tip. Really nice hair for a lot of hair wing applications, like I say, humpies, stimulators, things like that. I use this on a lot of flies. Screaming banshee. This has been one of my favorite hairs to work with for years and years and years. Cow elk, just to contrast, is going to be a little bit darker colored. Even yearling cow is going to be a little bit lighter colored than adult cow. So cow elk is going to be a little darker colored, typically a gray with more of a speckled kind of mottled tip, a little bit more band on it. And very often, really nice abrupt tips. If you get good hair from Josh Varner or Nature Spirit, you're going to have pretty good tips on the hair for the most part. If you are a hunter and you've ever had to drag a critter out, you've realized that you just ruined the hide. I don't know how these guys do it, but they find hides that didn't get drugged cross country, and they come out with really nice hair that is intact still. That's a big part of it. Now, cow elk is going to be coarser, larger diameter than yearling elk. So it's a coarser hair, so it's going to have a little bit more flare to it. So larger outside diameter, larger inside diameter. I'd say a medium thickness wall. So this hair will compress and flare really nicely on a fly like an elk hair caddis, something like that. where if you tied an elk hair caddis with yearling elk, and it's not to say that you can't, this is going to flare a lot more. So the hair is not going to hold its shape as well. It's going to flare up more. And that's really the application. It really just depends on what you want the hair to do. In the case of cow elk, this on a bigger stimulator, as you get down toward the butt ends, they're pretty large diameter and they'll flare very nicely. Mostly it's a darker colored hair. I find it a little coarse for smaller flies like a humpy or hair-winged wolf kind of thing. I find it a little coarse for the smaller size stuff. If you were tying big ones though, this would absolutely be the way to go. I use cow elk on flies like Danny Lane's DJL Drake. Makes a great wing on a fly like that. Lots of good applications and really a good natural color. That's a pretty gray color. So that's cow elk. Moving to bull elks. Bull elk is vastly different from either yearling or cow. Bull elk has got very small inside diameter, larger size outside diameter, and a very thick wall. So this hair flares very little. This is the hair I like to use for an elk hair caddis because it doesn't flare very much. It's going to hold its shape very well, and it's going to make a nice little tent wing that stays that shape when I tie it down. Bull elk, this is a piece of bleached bull elk, but bull elk is typically much more blonde colored than cow elk would be, and even yearling. You can see the difference in the color here. And again, like I say, this is bleach, but really the only thing that's changed color on this is the butt ends. So really that's only going to come into play if you're using the full length of the hair. Bull elk is a much harder hair. Like I say, it's got a thicker wall. It is relatively limited in application. You know, the stuff that it's good for, it's great for, but it's pretty hard for most applications. What do I've got here? So this is some elk rump. So this is off the butt end of an elk. And you can see how long this hair is. This hair is long, coarse. This is from a cow, I can tell by the gray color. Long, coarse hair. This is where you want, for an extended body green drake. I just mentioned Danny Lane's DJL Drake. That's elk rump in dyed olive. This is a coarse diameter hair. The tips are not as important. It's not typically used, although as I look at this piece, these tips are fantastic. Really nice, short, clean tips on this. This would be used for a large salmon fly pattern wing. It's got extra length, longer hair, and this is not even a particularly long piece of elk rump. But that's where you'd use elk rump. And you see as we're going through, it's sort of from fine to coarse, small diameter to larger diameter, and we're varying that wall thickness as you go through different types of elk hair. As we get into deer hair, there are all kinds of pieces of deer hair. And it gets very confusing these days because there's so many variables and pieces that are labeled differently. You know, the standard sort of Comparadun deer, there's a piece of Comparadun deer, is short deer body hair, short, fine deer body hair. And this typically comes from the shoulder. Depends again on the critter, the age of the critter. Younger critters tend to have better hair than older ones. But what this will have is short, fine tips, proportionally smaller, short, fine tips with a very abrupt tip, and typically larger diameter butts. The reason this works well for a Comparadun is because you can flare those butt ends down pretty close to the tips. That last tan into black tip section of any of these hairs is going to be relatively solid. So the shorter that is, the better. This piece is a great example. If you look at this line across the bottom, it's very straight. It's not jig-jagged. That tells me all that hair is about the same age, same growth rate. Not a lot of long hair sticking out of it. This is a beautiful chunk from Nature Spirit. Really a nice piece of hair. Really nice for X-Caddis, Comparaduns, Screaming Banshees, any sort of fly like that where you want the hair to flare. And again, deer hair is going to flare much better than elk hair would. Kind of moving through, here's a piece of X-Fine deer hair from Josh Varner. What X-Fine hair is the hair down the middle of the spine. So this is still from a deer. This is just the hair down the middle of the spine. And Josh's deer are from North Carolina, so they're a warmer weather critter. So their hair tends to be a little bit shorter and finer yet. But one of the cool things about this hair is it's very solid. So small inside diameter, fairly thick wall, but still small outside diameter. So this is a fairly solid hair, and you can see how beautifully marked that is. That back strip is just really nicely marked with those kind of chocolate-colored tips. Really nice for tails. You tie this hair down, it's not going to flare and make a big bushy tail. It's going to make a nice, clean, straight, almost hackle fiber looking tail. Really nice for that kind of stuff. Josh's short, fine stuff, The short fine hair is going to be a little bit bigger diameter. This is going to be from farther down along the sides of the critter. And what all that's going to mean is that the butt ends are going to have a little bit more diameter to them, and it's going to come closer to the tips. So for Comparadun wings, this is as we were talking about the Comparadun stuff, the short fine is the same type of stuff. And you can see the difference in length between these two. I can almost bet you that this piece of hair here in my left hand from Nature Spirit came from a Montana or Idaho deer, colder weather animal, warmer weather animal. You can just see the difference in the hair length. The hair from the western deer is a little bit coarser, a little bit bigger diameter, just more insulation for the animal, a little bit finer here. Both are great hairs. They're just different applications. As we come through, moose hair is one I get asked about a lot. I use moose body or moose hawk for tails on lots of my flies. Moose body comes from the body of the moose. It's pretty self-explanatory. Moose or elk hawk comes from the lower leg, from the elbow down. And that's very short, very hard, solid hair. It's not going to flare at all under any amount of thread pressure. Makes great tails, and that's about it. Not so useful for anything else besides tails, but makes beautiful tails. Moose body, close to the tips, is going to be the same kind of thing. This is a nice dark colored piece. It's got a few light tips in it. Sometimes you'll find this intermixed with white. Great in a lot of applications. Tails on an Adams with that mixed color works really nicely. Sort of looks like grizzly and brown hackle mixed together. Very useful. I use this on humpies, royal wolves, attractor dry stuff. Anything on an attractor fly where I want a heavier, bushier tail, I'll use moose body or moose hawk. And like I say, elk hawk is a great material as well. It's just much harder to get because none of you hunters are carrying the lower leg out of the woods anymore. And I don't blame you. I'd leave it there too. So that's moose hair. And then the big question that everybody's got about spinning hair, and where that comes from. So this is going to be further down the sides of the deer, along the rib cage, even into the rump. Spinning hair is going to be just standard deer body hair, really is what it is. But it's larger diameter hair. It's much coarser. And in this case, this is a piece of natural that has been probably bleached and then dyed yellow. And I'm guessing that has been bleached just by the coloration of the tips. So this is bleached and dyed. You can get it just dyed plain over natural, or you can get deer belly hair also, which will magically appear on my desk here, because Max is going to grab me a piece and bring it over because I didn't have it. But the difference being, with the natural tips, we've got some variegation to it. So when you're doing a collar on a fly like a sex dungeon, rather than have a monotone collar, you can have a little variegation to it. But what you're really looking for on spinning deer, told you it magically appeared. What you're really looking for on spinning deer is a hair that's relatively coarse, large diameter. So that's going to be a large inside diameter, large outside diameter, and thin wall. That hair is going to spin and flare very nicely. Really easy to control. Caribou is another hair that's very similar to that, even softer yet. We are currently cleaned out of Stephen Hankins Magpie Materials caribou hair, but we've been playing with that a lot lately, and that's a nice soft hair as well. Comes in one color. Deer hair comes in a lot of colors. Deer belly hair, you can see, starts off white. Starts off almost pure white. Well, I shouldn't even say almost. It's pure white. It's beautiful stuff. Very clean looking. So it takes dyes and colors really well. The catch here is because it's pure white, it's not going to have those variegated tips, and the tips are a little sketchy. They're not always all that great. Where this works great is on spun hair bugs, bass bugs, things like that, where you're going to cut the tips off anyway. So it's not a huge consideration that the tips are not in great shape, although this piece, as I look at it, is in pretty good shape. Looks pretty darn good, which does not surprise me at all from Josh. Really nice stuff, nice coarse diameter that's going to spin and flare nice, puff up nice, and really stand up to your blade when you trim it. So deer belly is specific use for hair bugs and things like that, or where you're spinning the butt end of the hair. Deer body hair, a natural deer body hair that's dyed, spinning hair, is going to have good tips, good nice colored tips that'll still stack up nicely, and large diameter butts so it flares and spins as you want it. That moose hair is going to be super solid, great for tails. Comparadun hair, where'd my Comparadun hair go? Comparadun hair is going to be larger diameter butts, but still nice, clean, short tips. Here's a piece of what's called ex-caddis hair, and this tends to have longer, wispier tips, really along the same lines as Comparadun hair, but you're going to want to apply this in a larger sized fly. And the reason is these gray butt ends are where the flare is going to come from. If you get too close to the tip, this hair is going to be very solid. So it depends on how far down the hair. The closer you get to the hide, the larger and softer that hair is going to be. It's going to taper down to a bigger diameter closer to the hide. So if you're tying it in long, it's going to flare pretty nicely. If you tie it in short, it's not going to flare as well. So again, it just depends on the application. There's a lot of variables to this. While we're covering this, when you're working with a piece of hair, and I've seen this so many times in class, and you're going to tie a size 14 elk hair caddis, don't cut off just the top half of the hair and leave that stub in the bottom. As you work your way up the piece of hide, eventually you're going to need a larger piece of hair, longer piece of hair. When you cut hair from the hide, always come in with your scissor tips, pull out the amount that you need, pull it out at a right angle to the hide, and cut it off flush to the hide. Then you'll have a nice clean patch of skin. As you work up the hide, you'll be able to get to it. So to show some of these points that I've been talking about, I'm going to stack up some of this hair and just show you the differences as we go through and how they will react on the hook to different thread pressures. So to start with here, we'll take, this is some blonde short fine hair, and I'm going to take a clump of this, and you always want to clean it out. And when you clean out deer and elk hair, the trick to this is, and man, I see people struggle with this endlessly. Even really good tires, I see struggle with this. And I can tell if you didn't clean your hair out well long after the fact. I can tell when I see your pictures on Instagram that you didn't clean the hair out well, because that underfur is still in your tie down area. To clean this hair out, what you want to do is grab it as close to the tips as you can. Don't hold the hair halfway down and then try to pull the underfur out. Hold it as close to the tips as you can, sort of fan it in your fingers, and then start to stroke that underfur out. You can use a little brush if you need to. I find a little dubbing wax on my fingers doesn't hurt a bit. That helps to pull that underfur out. Any of the short hairs that aren't as mature as the rest of the clump, you want to get cleaned out of there as well. And then if you've got anything that's extra long, you want to clean that out too. So then I'll take that hair and I'll put it tips down in my stacker. And if you've cleaned it well, you don't have to pound the tar out of this. Just a few taps, and you'll get a nice, clean, even stack. You saw I tapped that 5 or 6 times on my hand. I did not pound it on the desk. You don't have to wake the kids. If you clean the hair out well, it's not your stacker that's not working. If you don't clean it out well, it won't stack no matter how much you pound on it. If you get it cleaned out well, you get a nice, clean, straight, even band, and you can really see the division between the black tip, the tan stripe, and then the body of the hair. So that's how you stack hair. Now to get this out of here, you're just going to put your fingertip under it and close your thumb down, put your stacker back together, and then your hair's stacked. Okay, so there's a little trick to getting that out of there as well. So there's that chunk, and that was the short fine blonde hair from Josh Varner. Just as a contrast, this is the X fine hair from Josh, which is a much more solid, harder hair. And I'm going to cut this clump out and clean it out the same way. You can see all that short fine stuff that sticks together there. I'm going to clean that out. And typically with a small bunch of hair, I'll use my smaller diameter stacker. Excuse me. The reason being is if I take this small clump of hair and put it in my bigger stacker, it doesn't necessarily go in straight up and down. It wants to fall to the side, so the tips don't become square. I'm going to put this in my smaller stacker, give it a couple taps, and I've got a nice even band of color there. So when I take that out of my stacker, I've got a nice even band of color there. And with this particular clump of hair, it's got beautiful markings on it. Really comes out nicely. That's going to make a beautiful tail on a humpy. I should save that. As we come through and use some different hairs, if I take a clump of this spinning deer, the process is the same. Typically, the longer hair will have more underfur. So again, I'm going to grab it as close to the tips as I can, pull all those short hairs and underfur out, and just toss that. You can vacuum later. And I'll put a bigger clump of hair into my bigger stacker, medium-sized stacker. Oh, that stacker already had a clump of hair in it. Let's try that again. So I'm going to clean that out again. Now here's a great example that just sort of came up. I just took that chunk of hair out of a plastic bag, so it's got some static to it. You do not need to do anything fancy to this to take the static off of it. You don't need to rub it with a dryer sheet or spray anything on it or spray anything to your stacker. Your stacker doesn't have the static, the hair does. All you need to do to get that static out is lick your fingers and touch the hair. That'll take the static right out of it. and that hair will stack up nice and neat. Couple taps, and you can see this hair is going to have a few more broken tips in it. It's not going to be quite as clean on the tip barring, but for larger size applications where we're going to make a collar on a big fly, on a streamer head or a hair bug, bass bug, even a saltwater popper kind of fly, diver, this is going to have, proportionally the same sort of banding that we're looking for, that we would look for on a smaller fly. It's just bigger hair for bigger flies. And again, you can see the larger diameter butt, so that's going to compress under the thread pressure really well and flare out. That's what we're looking for that kind of hair. What else have we got? A great example of elk hair here. If I take a clump of this bull elk, very often bull elk have a lot of underfur. You can see how big that chunk started off. I started off and I ended up with half of it. So I'm going to clean all that underfur out, and I'll put that in my stacker. Give that a couple taps. And I've got a nice, clean, even bunch of hair to make a nice, tight little elk hair caddis wing. Just as a point of example, if I take that and press my thumbnail in it, you see that hair doesn't flare very much. Versus deer hair, if I set this piece down, deer hair, if I get it cleaned out, and stacked up, and I press my thumbnail into it, it's going to flare a lot more dramatically. And that's just imitating the thread pressure that's going to bite into that hair and flare that out. So if I can get a hold of this clump in my left hand, so equal thread or thumb pressure there, you can see the deer hair is going to flare a lot more than the hard bull elk will. And those are sort of two extremes, a very hard elk hair and a fairly soft deer hair. But that's the difference between the two. So now, just to sort of top this all off, I'm going to tie a couple pieces to a hook and show you what the difference is there. So I've got here in front of me just a size 14 hook. Nothing special. We're not going to tie a whole fly. We're just going to tie some hair down. And I'm not using anything special for thread here. This is just Danville 6/0, regular old-fashioned Danville 6/0, not anything particularly strong. So to start with, if I take a clump of bull elk hair and clean it out, and stack it up, when I go to tie this down, a shank length from the tips, where you would tie down, for instance, an elk hair caddis wing, I'll put 2 turns around that. You can see that flares just a little bit. You get a few turns to anchor it, but that wing didn't really change shape much. It's really staying pretty much in the configuration it was when I put it on the hook. Versus if I do the same thing with some deer hair, with the same thread, I didn't do a very good job of stacking that, but for our purposes that's not a big deal. I'm going to lay this in, again, about a shank length. I'm going to hold that hair in place, took 2 turns around it, tighten the thread toward me, and you see those buttons flare much more dramatically. Make a little bit more of a band here to anchor that down, and that wing is much bigger. It's going to spread out a lot more, so it compressed a lot more on the hook. If I took this same bunch of hair and worked down toward the buttons, so same clump of hair, if I work down toward the butt ends here, those butt ends are going to flare even more. It gets larger diameter as it gets closer to the hide. So you can see how that hair flares even more wildly as I get closer to the butts. If I take that same clump of hair and tie it in much closer to the tips, way up here, like I might for a size 18 Comparadun, when I tie this hair down, it's going to flare pretty minimally because that hair is a lot more solid toward the tips. You just have to think of the taper of that straw as it comes toward the tips. It's going to get a little more solid toward the top end. And that is the gist of deer and elk hair as best as I can explain it. I'm sure I forgot something. There's always something that I forgot. But I hope that helps. That's a great question. That's a question I get over and over in class. And I really would. I'm not trying to sell you a book, although I'd love to sell you a book. I make like $3 on those things. So, help a brother out. the book has got a really good chapter. It's something that, like I say, I didn't want to write, and it was a lot of work to write, so I hope you read it. It might be on our website. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it is. But you should check that out if you're interested in delving further into that. But that is my soliloquy on deer and elk hair for you today. That was an Ask Charlie question. If you've got more of them, just send them to AskCharlie@charlieslybox.com, and we'll get you in the queue and see if we can't get it answered next. You guys, thanks for watching. I'm Charlie.